Hello, I'm Josie and welcome to this presentation that talks through the module SHAPE. SHAPE was a 12-week journey split into two briefs teaching user experience design and human-centered thinking. This Gantt chart shows how I plan to spend my time over the 12 weeks. I have not used a Gantt chart to allocate my time before, but being able to clearly visualise deadlines each week stopped my research spiralling on and on. It's a tool that I will use again, that would most likely be useful in a group to allocate many tasks. So, for the first project, I created the Midlife app, a tool helping 45 to 55-year-olds transform inevitable time pressures into proactive timelines. In conversation with my mum one day, I was shocked to hear how pressured she felt to complete all of her ambitions before it's too late. I realised user interviews are my favourite research method because I enjoy digging deeper into the issue I'm solving with help from the person who knows that issue best. So, is this problem widely felt? Yes. With more research, I found people implementing deadlines such as the point at which their health may deteriorate and the point at which elderly relatives may need caring for into their ambitions. Through interviews and forum posts, I found that this lack of time actively worries the age group. I wish I could have expanded my research to outside of my location with user interviews and documentaries potentially to discover more and more factors in this panic. So my solution is a way to visualise these deadlines, to ease the pressure and put plans into action. I had learned that 45 to 55-year-olds certainly don't lack awareness and inclination, but with often many responsibilities to juggle, could benefit from separating and visualising their own path. Paper prototyping was a definite learning curve for me. I had assumed that everyone approached apps in their phone the same way as I would, but no. In fact, my mum wanted to include enter buttons and a list format, much like a computer that she is more used to. She even referred to her phone as a notebook in your pocket, which I leaned into with the design. I found gaining these small insights was where I was able to build empathy for someone who views the world through a different lens. I was a huge fan of the design with one mentality that pushed me to work with the original user to tailor the app experience. I was able to plan a journey map onto the app using Figma. I added examples of figures that found success later than planned, after feedback to keep the app motivational and light. I gained feedback mostly from my audience throughout the whole module, but I also shared work in progress on the online studio to gain feedback from industry professionals too, as suggested in a guest lecture from Eliza Hatch. I want to touch on the planning of the proposal. I had never made a proposal video before, so I was a little bit scared. Whilst I'm comfortable presenting, I usually lack quite a lot of structure. Therefore, I found this post-it note chart quite useful, especially to extract a narrative from my journey and stay on track. I will aim to build narrative into every pitch that I do, especially if I hopefully freelance in the future. Having said all that, I struggled to plan this current presentation in the same way because this process is made to be more pitchy than informative. So here is a mock-up of the app that I created. Next, I had a live brief to pick. I chose the visual identity brief. Here I had to focus on an audience of aged 18 to 25 students or graduates. Inspired by Open Practice's working process, I highlighted keywords that encompassed the brief. Although I did struggle to refer back to this at first, resulting in a bit of a creative spiral, once I printed this page out and stuck it to my wall, I couldn't escape the need to constantly centre my design. I will need to do this in future with clients in order to please them, I think. Then I started assumption mapping. I compared assumptions of the audience and the event. I was shocked with the disconnect and made it my mission to align white-walled galleries with bold students. Assumption mapping would benefit from a larger group, since I only have one perspective. So whilst assumption mapping was a useful starting point, where it's just me working on projects in the future, I would probably just list assumptions rather than using my time to map such limited points. I should have initiated a group session online with peers completing the same brief to generate more ideas. Before jumping in, I needed to look at how to challenge these assumptions and where I was going to find information. I struggled to think of many options and should have asked for recommendations at this point. As you can see, I am lacking primary quantitative sources, which resulted in holes in my research. Next, I conducted competitor research. It was important that I didn't look only at what I did and didn't like, but also what fitted with the words I highlighted in the brief. I loved Bournemouth's mimicking of the physical space, and KSA shows colour picker wheel for accessibility. There was information I had not considered, like on-campus event details that I went on to include in my own design. Again, looking at more examples, the limited colour palette and short slogan titles inspired my design. I realised to showcase the work, I must simplify any design I do. Here, I explored different spaces that could host the visual identity. I took this image in Plymouth of the Arts University, which made me consider where my visual identity needs to be to create maximum impact. Born from this were large, colourful window decals you'll see later. I did a lot of my research on the student life section of Falmouth University's website. I found this secondary source very useful because whilst I had access to my cohort, I felt that feedback from people who knew the brief was tilted towards how to get marks rather than their own opinions as a student audience. In the virtual tour, I loved this Ferris wheel, which set the tone for the visual identity. This gave me a sense of the atmosphere around graduating at Falmouth. So, I wanted to delve into this and ask the question, what does celebration and fun look like to Falmouth students and graduates, since this is a key word in the brief? The standout themes were live music, beaches, festivals and independence. That's independent spaces, independent music, independent artists, etc. I want my visual identity to tell this story. This is what celebration is to Falmouth, and we're celebrating something cool here. I pulled out these festival flag shapes from an image of last year's graduation and used the iconic shapes as key motifs. Then I took some widely used festival flag colours to create my colour palette. Colour palette development was a standout moment for me because I had to think about empathy in a different way than the last brief. Empathy in this brief centred a lot around accessibility. I used colourable.com to test the readability of colours to ensure the exhibition could be enjoyed by the full audience. I had to adjust every colour and almost had to get rid of my favourite orange altogether until I came across Accessible Orange. This colour was an eye-opener for me. It's made me think I would like to work to create more accessible design tools in the future, alongside the users it may help. Speaking of tools, I sent a toolkit out for students and staff for feedback, asking them and my sister, a Falmouth student that was very luckily home on Easter break, for feedback on choices like potential colour palettes. Together, we decided monochromatic social media post would work best alongside traditional subjects like fine art, which needed to be considered. We had an interesting discussion about abstract shapes brought up by someone in the cohort. I found this interesting because it does lead towards graphic design. After all, that's the kind of work that I've decided I would like to put out in the future. But I also think that the point of going for large abstract shapes was to not detract from the students' work. Defending your decisions was something that came up in the webinar with Katie Evans, and I was inspired. Surprisingly, getting feedback was most useful when it inspired a response from me, because I knew then what felt correct to do. When I felt completely lost, I needed to take the audience's advice, but when I felt a reaction, then I could develop in a way that felt true to my style. Moving on to the website design, I was introduced to site mapping in a lecture, which isn't something that I had had to do before. I had an idea of my head of what the website was going to look like, but the site map and storyboarding after forced me to fill in gaps I had left out. I tested a prototype with a member of my audience, my sister. We came up with ideas like having all of the buttons be flag-shaped or flag-coloured. Also, things like adding an X in the top right-hand corner of the pop-up to close a section. There were so many practical insights that came from this that you just can't see from your own point of view, I've found. I wish I could have tested with a larger group to find more pain points. However, I didn't have time to create a full Marvel mock-up, which I could have sent out to the cohort to gain wider feedback. So, the last step really of this project was creating a proposal. I wanted to create one that I could use again and again for different projects and maybe my own portfolio in the future. As you can see, it's got quite a clean aesthetic because of this. It was also important to document my outcomes in realistic mock-ups. This is inspired by Katie Evans. She taught to show scale against hands and objects like windows when documenting. If I had time, I would have liked to print out these physical invites and play around with the scale and also some printing techniques. This website mock-up was inspired by Short Notice Studio. I think it was a nice way of kind of adding excitement. I will use this kind of focal mock-up in other projects that I do in the future. Reflecting on the time that it took, I was surprised actually. I kept very close to my deadlines. I do work best to deadlines, which I found out through doing this Gantt chart activity. There were a few weeks that overlapped. There were weeks that I ended up going away, so I had to kind of rejuggle my time. But I have been pleasantly surprised with this method. I think in future I'm going to carry on making these charts because I need that structure when organising my time. Reflecting on the module as a whole and where I would like to go in the future. I don't see myself making lots of apps as a UX designer, as cool as that is. The design is what I prefer more than the kind of technical side of UX design. But I will continue to bring empathy into design teams and understand different age groups and people that I am not. I'm grateful for this module for bringing that empathy to my design work. I also have a huge range of tools now that I've never used before. Figma is a massive one that I've grown to love for prototyping. Making mock-ups has been a really fun process too. Also, I will use Miro and assumption mapping where relevant in group activities. I think I've also just gained so much confidence in reaching out to people and gaining feedback and confidence in my own design abilities. I've come to a place where I get excited to have user feedback to enhance my work. I don't ever see it as conflict with my design ideas now. So, although I may not be a full UX designer in the future, I will definitely be using these human-centered design principles in all of my work moving forward.